You are listening to Future Voices, a podcast brought to you by Beha Futures Foundation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest Futures Voices podcast brought to you by Bosnia Herzegovina Futures Foundation. My name is Mahmoud Ahmed, and I'm education team leader within the foundation. Joining us today is Nataša Kusmuk, born in Sarajevo. Natasha is a senior Austrian public servant and former CEO with proven expertise across areas of refugee settlement and migration, multicultural and indigenous affairs, youth empowerment, stakeholder engagement, business and contract management, governance and risk management, and social service policy and programs. Natasha currently works as an advisor on the Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Pacific region for the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, Austrade, and is the chairperson for a non-for-profit organization, the Sister Project. Welcome, Natasha, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's a pleasure.
So I will start asking first question is a little bit about your youth. How did you arrive to Australia all the way from Bosnia? Well, we know that you have a very modest education and poor knowledge of the English language, and today you are an advisor for the Australian Commission. And can you tell us about your experience of moving to another country and possible insecurities in the skills you offered?
Not a problem. So I guess, as you said, I was born in Sarajevo. I was almost 10 years old when I arrived in Australia, in Western Australia. So away from the most popular areas like Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane on the eastern coast, where a lot of former Yugoslav refugees and migrants came. So a very small community here in Perth, Western Australia. And so learning English was your primary concern. I didn't know very much English. My mum did. My dad had no knowledge of English. And so it was definitely like coming to Mars. Out of nowhere, you had to learn English. That's your most important skill. If you don't have the English language, you can't do anything. I suppose we obviously came as refugees, and at the time and even now, we've obviously got a lot of turmoil around the world. People look at you a little differently, so you have the insecurity of I need to, fit in. I need to do my very best to fit in, to do my best to learn the language, and try to not make so many mistakes, no matter what your age is, whether you're 10, whether you're 20, and like my parents, they were in their 30s. You do need the language. I suppose another insecurity, aside from English language, is trying to navigate the actual physical environment. So it's different setup in every country, and in Australia, the bureaucracy, who do you need to ask? Where do you need to go? How do you get a driver's license? Do you need to pay taxes? Where do you get a job? How do you enroll your kids in school? What does school look like? The curriculum's different. So a lot of those unknowns become your insecurities and stresses when you move to another country. And if, I suppose, like most migrants, you don't have the option to do a lot of research before you move, you then rely on communicating with people you meet, people you might know, or just going to ask people at schools or relevant government organizations, where do I get this information? Where do I get the help? So it becomes a bit of a stress trying to settle in. And I think one of the biggest issues for me was schooling. And I think schooling and learning in another language in another country is probably one of the biggest insecurities young people face when moving to another country, even if they know English, because the way the system's set up, I think in Australia in particular, but in countries like the US and others, it is very different. The teaching methods are different. The classroom setups are different, and including how you submit your assignments. How do you speak to your classmates? Do you talk to your teacher directly, or do you need to email your teacher? Or what is it that you need to do? So those are, I think, some of the biggest insecurities: language and then communication, followed by trying to navigate the unknowns in another country. My experience was thankfully overall quite positive. I think I had a lot of support being a young person, people recognize, especially in Western countries, that moving is a scary process, especially for those young people. And so you will often come across very knowledgeable people, people who are aware that this is really a scary process, and they will come to your help and aid. So I was lucky enough to have some good teachers and classmates who perhaps spoke Bosnian or Serbian or a language I understood, and they could help me navigate my first year at the school. It was also lucky that we had a very supportive community after a while, learning, where my parents had to go to work and what the story was in terms of who picked me up from school, or did I have to walk to school myself. And just the distances, I think, for me were a shock because, as you know, in Bosnia and Sarajevo, Bosnia is a small place compared to Australia, much smaller. Australia's approximately the size of all of Europe. And so Western Australia is massive. Living in Perth, basically anywhere you go, it takes you 15 to 30 minutes by car to get there. Very long stretches of road. And so I really did not feel confident about using public transport. So I guess that was my last insecurity as a young person, figuring out how I will get to where I need to go. And I think that comes down again to being able to speak the language and ask someone for help.
Yeah, that's really great answer. We can circle back a little bit later on communities. What I would like to ask you now is a little bit about the importance of formal and informal education. You mentioned a little bit about your studies and how they
Mhm.
went. And I would like to ask you, since you have experience on two different continents, what difference in structure did you notice, if any? And how much do you think should be devoted to just education? What else we should take in count as when we talk about informal? How much informal education represents the formal organization?
Mm. Look, of course, formal education's, the number one ticket that everybody looks at when you're going to go for a job. So after you turn 18, often your education becomes the biggest part for you to secure work in any country. Um, but I think going back to education, formal education specifically, before I go into the informal, the structure is incredibly different from country to country. And I think between Europe and Australia, two different continents, two different areas of the world, I find that in Europe, there is a bit more push, I think, towards sciences and mathematics, for instance. In Australia, I found that there was a lot more push towards social sciences, English. I think English probably very much a challenge for a lot of people, but it is the number one subject that you have to pass to be able to graduate high school. If you can't pass that, you can't finish high school. And so that definitely is one of the biggest changes in structure, that you have to pass English. The other thing is, I think the way they teach, the curriculum is set out approximately over 13 weeks per term, similar to Europe. They have a sort of a longer summer break like we do. Of course, the summer break is over December and January rather than how it is in the Northern Hemisphere. But I think the biggest thing is they do tell you up front what you will be studying. So they will say, first week, this is what we'll cover. And there is a lot more push for you to know what will be in an exam, what will be in a test. They don't always get it right because there is a lot to cover, but the onus is on you as the student to learn. So not everything will be covered in your day-to-day classes. You have to be the one that goes out and learns and reads. Whereas I found in Europe, there was a lot more practical help where they sort of said, if you don't learn this, you will not pass the test. And it was almost like very obvious that you had to know a particular part of the curriculum. So even though it's well structured in Australia, I felt like unless you as the student took that extra time to do the extra work, you wouldn't succeed. You would pass, but you wouldn't do extraordinarily well if you didn't read outside the curriculum, which is where I think informal education comes into play. Obviously, school is very structured. It's very pushing for those pure subjects, maths and English and sciences, different types of sciences. Informal education becomes a really important part of you expanding those other skills that you don't really learn in school, I think, and I am a big fan of volunteering as an informal education pathway. So doing internships is an absolutely fantastic way to learn those communication skills in the office, which you can't really teach in a school environment. It also gives you that extra bit of confidence to learn how to express yourself, how to use the skills you've learned or use the knowledge that you've learned in school to actually put into practice in the real world. And what I mean by that is I did some volunteering and some teaching, some tutoring for younger students when I was in year 11 and 12, so my later years in high school. And, secondary education is scary, it's tough sometimes, but I found that teaching younger students things that I'd learned about 2-3 years prior actually helped me learn better and sort of consolidate my learning style in my later education. So I was getting a little bit of money from tutoring, which I thought was fantastic, getting a bit of money at that young age. But it really did help me learn, where do I improve my skills? Where do I improve my learning style? And it really made me confident when it came to my final exams in high school. The other type of informal education, I think, I can't really put a percentage of it, but I think, 80% of the time, if you're in high school, you would be focused on your primary education, which is your school curriculum. If you're in tertiary education, so your university, for instance, I think informal education takes an even bigger role. So your internships and volunteering, because when I hire people in my organization and previous organizations, I actually would look at the volunteering experience more than the actual formal paid experience. And what I mean by that is people who are willing to learn, who are willing to work for no money, will be able to do anything for you for money. So those people that have gone out and done an internship will look very favorable because they've gone that extra step to learn that extra thing. And I think informal education, once you leave high school, when you've gone into the university, sort of in your 20s, university education, I think informal education is so vital to make yourself attractive to an employer. And it makes you even more confident when you go for interviews and when you get a job, because you already know how to function in a work environment. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you for such an informative answer. I must say, when you mentioned the forms of informal education, first thing that comes to my mind, and you said, is communication. And with communication as a necessary part of your job, you manage relations with clients, taking into consideration that you now work in a state-owned company from a country that does business with different parts of the world. What kind of experiences with the mentality of people you came across?
That's a fantastic question. And it's one that it's hard to answer, but I'll try. So communication is essential, obviously. I mean, our whole entire world has changed in the last 20, 30 years. You're on the phone to people, you're obviously on Zoom calls, you're on emails, and you're in person as well. And that communication is just exploded. It's the number one thing in all jobs, I think. So I obviously work with people from all over the world, all over the world. Southeast Asia is one of the biggest parts, but I've also worked with people from Africa and different cultures that are quite challenging because they're different. They're different in the way they communicate. They're different in the way they think about time, for instance. Obviously, in our culture, in Bosnian culture, in Australian culture, time is a very simple concept. If someone says you'll be there at 4 p.m., it means you'll be there at 4 p.m., give or take a little bit of time just in case you're late or early. But generally, that means you will be punctual. And I think communication also comes to your physical communication, being somewhere on time. I've actually found that from some cultures in Southeast Asia and Africa, people don't actually relate to time the same way. So I organized a meeting very early on in my career with a bunch of different people from different cultures, and I expected them all to come at 10 o'clock in the morning. Half of those people didn't come until 11. And in my culture, in our culture, it is considered rude to be incredibly late, but in their culture, it's actually not. So for them, the idea is that you will get ready, you will get there eventually. And someone came up to me and said, "You don't understand, but this is Africa time. We don't look at time the same way as you." So they don't look at a watch, they just show up when they're ready. They show up when their elders show up, and they start their meetings with their elders are there. And I found that incredibly challenging because I've never read that in a book. I've never experienced that in any other way except that moment when I had to run a meeting. I actually had no idea that that was something that happens. So that's actually quite a challenging mentality of certain people, things like their concept of time. I also find there are some cultures where they're quite timid. So I worked with some people from Myanmar or Burma, and they're fantastic people, really gentle, really kind people, absolutely highest respect for them. But my challenge was they never look at you in the eyes when they speak if they think that you're an elder or you're superior to them in any way or you've got more power to them. So they actually are quite timid and they won't look at you in the eye. They'll be very softly spoken. And I found that quite challenging as well. I still do sometimes, especially when you're negotiating with them or you're speaking to them about something really important. It almost feels like they don't trust you or that they're uncomfortable or they're not telling you the whole truth. But it's their culture. So, in their culture, if you're seen as the power holder, it's disrespectful to look at you in the eyes. And that's something I had to learn working with different cultures, something that I did not read in a book. It just had to happen that way. I do find that generally when you're working globally, and of course, I don't have a choice, it's Australia is so isolated, we have to work with the world to stay connected. Um, Doing business with different parts of the world is not only challenging in the way they communicate and the different time zones that you have to take into account, but I think people have a different way of running their businesses. They have a different concept of what the end goal of their business is. And I think I'll leave you with this really important distinction. With business in some parts of the world, and I found this a lot with the difference between the Middle East, for instance, and the Western world and Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, I found that, and Asia generally, that tradition and those good relationships with their clients were more important than profits. So if they had high profits, but a high turnover of staff where their staff would leave and their stakeholders or the business clients would leave, that's seen as a not a successful business. But I found a lot of the time, if they kept their traditions and they kept their clients close to them, and the profits weren't so good, but they were making some profits, that's considered a successful business in Asia. In most parts of the world, especially in the Western world, and we obviously have the banking systems to think about in terms of say Western Australia or America, profits are the number one target, and that is the KPI that they work towards. So it's quite interesting working with different types of cultures and different types of people. What's important to them when we're negotiating, when we're talking about working together and collaborating. That sort of, I suppose, that was something that I did not expect. That was incredibly different across cultures, the way people look at business and what that means for them. So managing those relationships can be quite difficult, but the key is to remember that not everyone's like you and you're not like everyone else. And focusing on what you want to get out of some of those relationships is key, and understanding that communication is really just absolutely everything and number one thing to focus on.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. Thank you for taking your time with it. I must say, even with the work that Foundation does in the past 3 years, I know for myself when I organize the meetings and there is time difference, I'm always double, triple, 4 times. I need to check did I do it right? And even then, there is times when there is clock changes for either 1 hour forward or backwards, and in those 2 weeks, it's always catastrophic because everyone forgets
Yes.
about it. And I know how it is. Honestly, I didn't need to work with Africa that much, but I know that you did as a volunteer. And I would love if you could talk a little bit. How did you end up working with African countries, volunteering? If I got it right, could you explain us a little bit about that?
Of course. Interestingly enough, I started working at the Department of Immigration and Citizenship here in Australia. It was my first government job about 13 years ago now. And I started meeting all these people from Africa, because that was Africa and the Middle East was sort of the biggest refugee and migrant intake for a little while there. And I'd obviously never encountered African refugees in the same way that I did in my job. And I started learning a lot about places like South Sudan and Liberia and those countries where, we often have this bias, I think, that Africa is generally a very poor continent, and that, there's a lot of conflict and a lot of issues. But in Western Australia, we have this amazing organization called the Organisation of African Communities in WA. And they actually had this fantastic young leader in his sort of late 20s. And he basically pulled together all these African migrants, all these communities that basically came from various parts of Africa. So they had people from South Africa, they had Kenya, they had your Nigerians, you had everything from Egypt to pretty much everywhere. Like, there were countries I didn't know existed, all different languages, of course. And I actually started going to a lot of their events. They had a lot of celebratory events, and started becoming really good friends with them as well through my work. And I found that I met this gentleman who actually wanted to come. So he's an Australian man who wanted to set up a library for children, youth, who couldn't afford books in South Sudan. And South Sudan at the time was going through a lot of conflict and war, and quite a high stress job, that one. But I helped out to ensure that he could actually set that up a little bit. And I didn't really know what that was going to look like, but he basically started a bit of a charity to help young people. And so one of the things that I've been doing is mentoring African people here in Australia as well, because I think education for them has been so stunted, especially if they've come later in life, haven't had all the years of education required to complete high school or university here in Australia. And it's quite interesting because I started to really enjoy it. And so now wherever I turn, I'm working with an African person, whether formally or informally. And unfortunately, I missed out on a chance to go and visit Africa and do a whole tour of Africa with some government friends of mine, especially the WA police. They were lucky enough to go and meet a lot of amazing people from one of the biggest refugee camps, Kakuma, which has a lot of South Sudanese refugees, and it's run by the United Nations. But a lot of those people do come to Perth, and interestingly enough, they stay here and they settle here, and they bring a lot of that culture and knowledge. And so I feel like I've almost been there. But I hope to one day soon go. I've had plans for many years to go and do some volunteering in Africa in those organizations, which I've seen grow, such as the library and such as the refugee camp. And I think it would be an absolute education to actually be there. But it is challenging working with people who have come from Africa specifically, who have a lot of trauma. So I find that I'm actually learning a lot about the psychology of people who have gone through some serious and difficult times of their life, especially young people. So it's been an interesting ride.
It's a really interesting answer, I must say. I didn't expect it to be this way. I need to be honest. I thought I was about to listen to your volunteering in some organization that sometimes helps Africa in some cases, but I didn't know it was this much focused on the work that you have done. And I must ask, what is the thing that moves you to do so much volunteering, to do the mentoring? And did you ever come to that point where you just want to burn out of the volunteering, and you just want to say, I'm done here, I've done my part? And what keeps you going? Just what is that thing that is like parallel, and you're looking at it, okay, this is the reason I'm volunteering, and this is why I'm gonna continue to volunteer?
That's a fantastic question. A lot of people say that the most toughest task for someone is to give up their time and not be paid for it, not be compensated for it. And a lot of people say, well, why would you work for free? Because obviously in this day and age, volunteering is seen as you working for free. I think, young people are increasingly pushed into a very unnatural way of operating at the moment, fast and online and very detached. And I know it makes work and study quite easy and efficient, and it creates that almost an easy access environment. But what I actually found as a young person who grew up with that first generation of computers introduced into schools, the computers, internet, that kind of communication where everything's fast and online, it creates a really lonely environment where it's kind of hard to build those powerful networks of stakeholders who have the wisdom and the trust and advice and support. So I found as a young person, when I felt the most successful and confident in my skills was actually when I had that supportive person by my side or a network around me. And I find that right now, young people don't really have that unless they go out and look for it, or unless there's a program that's been set up by an organization or a government that cares about that. So I suppose I have a younger brother as well, who is 6.5 years younger than me. And I found that as an older sister, for instance, I would just naturally go and just mentor my brother through really tough times and help him out, whether it's school or university or whatever. And he often said, it really helped. It really helped that you gave me the time and the support and advice when you really didn't need to, like you didn't get anything out of it. And I actually found so many young people through university and community networks now that I work in, who actually need the same amount of help, have the same amount of talent and motivation, but they have no support from the families because their parents might work full-time jobs, or they have really large families, sometimes several siblings, 5, 6 kids, and they just don't get that support because they just don't have the time. So what motivated me initially to get into volunteering was actually teaching and supporting people who were going through school. And I think that was actually really the start of my passion for volunteering. I found that by teaching them, I was learning as well. And I also find that I became better at communicating with different types of people. And we talked about cultures already, but also walks of life. Not everyone has the luck to go to school. I think that's we take it for granted sometimes, but there are people in the world who don't get an education because of war or whatever. So I found that that was my first step into it. Now, it's obviously education that got me into it, but I think volunteering later in life, once I've got, I started my career, I actually find that volunteering helps me learn and self-develop. And one of the ways that happened was I would just say, okay, well, someone needs help, I'll go help them. Or someone would ask me for advice or go, look, I need to apply for a job, but I don't know how to write a resume. Can you help me out with a resume? And yes, there are people who are paid to do this as a job, but I actually found it really fulfilling to be able to see someone else succeed in life. And so, yes, at some point when you go out there and you give your time, you have very little time left for yourself. So I did actually reach burnout. About 5 or 6 years ago, I actually felt like I was working 2, 3 full-time jobs because I was volunteering so much and I had a full-time job, which was paid. And so I found that I had no time for myself. I had very little time for any kind of recreational activities or family time. And I actually found that I was no longer good at helping people because I was so tired. And I wanted to give up. I absolutely wanted to give up and just go, nope, I'm going to have a full-time job and not do any of this extra stuff. Why am I doing this? And that's where I think it became very obvious. It helped me through some of the toughest of times being connected with all these people. So, I mean, you obviously say, how do you keep pushing and motivating others? I think the actual help that I provided others often motivated me more because people would often sort of come back and say, oh my God, I got the job, or I passed my test, or I managed to do something which was amazing, or help, a family member out because of your advice, because of your mentoring, because of your support. And some organizations were able to do a lot more because they didn't have to pay me. I did this work for free. And so they could do a lot more with what they had, with their resources. And so it gave me a bit of motivation to know that I'm actually quite important in this organization or this community. And it gave me the confidence to continue. But instead of continuing to do everything, I realized that I had to keep a little bit of time for myself because if you don't help yourself first, you can't help others. And that's something that I always say to people who want to volunteer. Leave a little bit of yourself and your time sort of secret and sacred, because if you don't, you will burn out, because volunteering can become more stressful and more tiring than a full-time job. But it is motivating to see people succeed when you give them a little bit of your wisdom or your time. And it's definitely what keeps me going, knowing that I can do a lot with very little. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's pretty much the same for me when I take I look back to my volunteering, and even now at the moment I'm volunteering with hosting this podcast for the past now 4 years, and sometimes I really did think, all right, I'm done with it. I have my faculty, I have my job, and it at some point volunteering came first in my life. Like first, I will do everything that's needed for volunteering, then I will do my faculty, and then I will circle back to my job, and I found that I have no time to sleep. Like
Yes.
I had like 3, 4 hours at the best, and most of the days I will just be like, all right, it's time for like 2 30-minute naps, and that's it. And
Mhm.
so I ease back a little bit to it. So I I can really relate to everything that you're doing, but also I can relate to the feeling of just being proud of the what you have done, and even now what you are doing, we are really proud of. So I would love to talk to you a little bit about being the CEO of Edmund Rice Center, and what have you done there? You're now the stakeholder, the chair there, and what is it about? How did you get there? How did you get to be the CEO? And what particularly proud are you in the work you have done there?
That's a fantastic question. So, um, getting the CEO position before the age of 30 was actually really scary. I didn't think I could do it when I applied, but I got it. And then I thought, well, what am I going to do here? The organization sort of looks after a lot of amazing people, empowers a lot of young people in youth leadership and sport. There's a lot of developmental programs that they had for low socioeconomic women and people from refugee backgrounds. And especially, I mean, I will focus on the youth. It was incredible. And I think that's part of the reason why I actually said yes, and I continued to do that, because um, while the CEO experience in any organization is scary and a lot of things fall on you. So your financial management, your governance, your management of staff, and all the paperwork that comes with it. I can't tell you how much paperwork there was, but there was a lot. And it is stressful. It's almost like you don't have time to sleep. Your 5 day a week job becomes a 7 day a week job 24/7, because you're always on call. But what I found was I was able to actually relate to the work I was doing finally, because you're sitting at your computer, often in a job somewhere, and you're pressing buttons at a keyboard. And you don't really think about what those buttons do. But in my job, every time I did a piece of paperwork or I had a meeting with an important stakeholder, I knew that I was doing that to help those young people, to help those refugee communities, to build something. And often on the weekends, they would have a lot of different sports programs and development programs for young people, especially leadership programs. And I would go out there on my own time just to see whether, what I'm doing is actually hitting the ground. And what I would see is groups of young people really happy, really smiling, succeeding. And I think one of the biggest successes was seeing young people getting awards and getting into sports teams. We had various people from our organization with all the youth support and youth programs and development programs who ended up. I mean, one gentleman, actually, a young man, he actually went back to South Sudan to play for the football team. We had someone who ended up in the NBA doing basketball, because that was his passion, and he, worked for it. We had a couple of people stay here in Australia in different sports, in different environments. Right now, there's a young lady from Afghanistan who has become I suppose, a senator here in the Australian federal government. And a couple of years ago, she was actually a participant in one of the youth programs. So seeing some of those things come out, and now even after I've sort of moved on from the CEO role, many years later, I'm sure I'm still going to be seeing this, but those young people that the work helped, the programs helped, are now coming out as leaders in their own right, in their communities, in politics, in sports, in education, in various different environments. And I think that's probably what makes me the most proud of that work. I think the results obviously speak for themselves. There has been a lot of young people who have come from really difficult backgrounds, poverty, really, really difficult family environments as well, violent environments as well. And seeing them sort of blossom into these amazing leaders who are incredible at what they do. And they started off just like all of us who have perhaps moved to different countries and are very uncomfortable and not sure of ourselves. And then several years later, they've just become these amazing people. So I mentioned the senator in the federal government. Her name's Fatima Payman. If you want to look her up, she is impressive. Her story is amazing. And she's probably one of my favorite stories, I think, from the time that I was at Edmund Rice Center. But she never really saw herself in politics, I think, until she started attending those programs and doing some volunteering and leadership. And she just found herself in it. And people really liked her, people voted for her. And here she is, representing Western Australia at the national level. So absolutely incredible story. And she's incredibly young too. I won't say her age until you look her up on Google, but she is very young. And for her age and for her background, where she's come from, her story is absolutely incredible. And I certainly wouldn't like to take credit for it, but the organization itself, the success stories coming out of it, it was just an incredible pleasure to be part of that and part of her story as well as others. And when you talk about burnout and volunteering and work and just not having enough time, I think later, if your work does what this has done for me, where it tells me a story and goes, all that time you've put in, all that effort, all those sleepless hours, look what's happened. It's amazing. That gives me incredible pride that, that work was able to actually hit the ground and help someone. So it was an incredible journey.
Yeah, that's really amazing. I had no idea about the enormous impact that you had there, especially about the story about Fatima. So I get, I never imagined the amount of the impact that you really could made there, but it really sounds astronomical. So I only have two more questions left. First one would be, what ways of earning money do you see for young people so that they can find employment as soon as possible?
Oh, that's a hard one, isn't it? Number one,
Yeah,
currency
I
is
left
still
the
money, isn't it?
yeah, I left
uh,
the hardest one for the end just to
of
soften
course
you
you
up a
did.
little bit with the easy ones.
You got me very comfortable with the other
Yeah.
ones. Look, money's a tough one. Money's a tough one because in this world, money it runs the world. We know that. So from the west to the east, anywhere you go, money is the only way to get there. Money is the only way to function. Money is the only way to pay your bills and have a house or have a rental or own a car or get around, buy food, all of that. We all know that. And money is hard to find sometimes. But I think for young people, I reflect on a conversation I had with my parents not too long ago. My parents grew up in an era where there wasn't, computers weren't in every office. And if you had a computer, that was amazing. Now we've got all these computers that are just, I have two in my office, two laptops, and most people have access to the internet. And I often say when young people go, what can I do to make money? I want to get money fast. I want to get employed. There's a couple of things that I often say. So find a job that will pay your bills. Build a career that's going to build your foundations for passion. And so what I mean by that is your career doesn't have to earn you money. It doesn't have to give you a lot of money to pay bills. In fact, it could be something that you volunteer and gives you passion and excitement. But your job definitely needs to give you income. And today you could do anything as long as you either have the right qualifications or the right experience, or you live in the right place. And I say that because it's not always your education that determines whether or not you have a successful job or a career. It's not always whether you can speak English. There are other languages in the world that can get you a job. I find that geography is also important, and I say this because today we're talking and we're on two different sides of the world. If you and I had businesses, we could work right now and be making money, even though we're not sitting in the same office in the same country, or even working the same way. And so with young people now, I think there is so much opportunity to have online made income. So whether it's you have a startup, or you are selling something you've made online, and I know a lot of young people here who have small crafts, or they do painting, or they build something and they're shipping it over across the world because someone's bought it on eBay, which, boggles my mind, but that can happen, and they make money. Or a startup. My younger brother, actually, he has a day job. He works 9 to 5, 5 days a week, but on the side, he has a startup, and that's his passion. It doesn't make a lot of money yet, but it's something that he's using to build his future, and that's what he wants to do. And I think that's incredible that young people can now have, both a job and a career, whereas back our parents would just have a job to pay bills. They wouldn't think of a career unless they were a lawyer or accountant or a police officer or something similar. They would just have a job to pay the bills, to feed the family, whereas young people now can do both. And so I urge young people to go online and see what's out there. What are other people doing? How are other people making money? Is there a passion area that you've got? You might be an engineer, but what else do you like to do? You might be really good at writing books. You might be really good at painting. You might be an incredible singer. I mean, people have written songs for people who are incredibly famous, and that's got them money as well. So it just doesn't matter what you do. Money can be made in this world using just about anything. And I don't need to mention the online platforms that we have around at the moment, but we have people who are, on Instagram making ridiculous amounts of money taking pictures of their dog. So it's just absolutely anything. You could do anything at the moment. I think the biggest scary thing right now is because there's so much out there and it's so competitive, we're still stuck in the way of thinking we need to get education to have money. And you can do both at the same time. And I can certainly tell you, I finished my master's degree while working full time. So it's not exclusive. So look online and use your geography. You no longer have to be in America to make money in America. You can be sitting in Boston and making money for an American company while working online and studying. So lots of opportunities out there, but I think research for young people is the key, looking it all up and seeing what's out there and just picking something and going with it.
Thank you so much for truly an amazing answer, and I must say it perfectly ties for my last question. You mentioned your brother a little bit, and we already talked in the past about the book that you're writing with your brother, and I just want to ask how's it going, and can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Look, we haven't told many people, but we actually both would sit down with a cup of coffee in Bosnian fashion and just sit and talk for many hours about all the things that we're struggling with at work or with our personal lives. And we found ourselves just really having this amazing conversation with a lot of wisdom, with a lot of knowledge and experience. And we just thought, we should actually write this down because there's probably young people out there that really want to hear this because they're going through something similar. And so how's it going? It is still going, thankfully. It's not finished yet. We're hoping in the next 6 to 12 months to sort of have it hopefully on different platforms. My brother at the moment, being in IT, is hoping that we agree to put at least a part of the book on Amazon so everyone can access it for a very low cost. But the book is about startups. So at the moment, our working title is How to Start Up and Fail. So it's all about failures that you may encounter with embarking on any new project, especially a startup. So my brother obviously having 2 startups, me having worked with startups, having seen people fail miserably, especially young people, but having a lot of people succeed. And we wanted to sort of write some funny stories in there. So this whole book is not a very serious book. It has a lot of serious facts, there's a lot of serious information, but it's actually done in the style that my brother and I speak, and that is comedy. So it's quite funny. It's all about basically having ideas and how to see them through or how to see them fail. And I think there will be a really good step-by-step guide in there, in a way to show people how easy it is to succeed and yet how easy it is to fail in this modern world. So some interesting, I suppose, food for thought for you there. But as soon as we've sort of got a final draft, I might send you a copy to have a read, but I'm hoping to have a sort of a book launch at some point, and whether it would be me or my brother that does it, we do hope to bring it to Bosnia as well, because we'd love to have young people access it. From what I've seen, young people in our part of the world there are just absolutely talented, knowledgeable, and they just need a little tiny bit of help to succeed. So I hope at least someone who reads our book will have that experience. And it would be fantastic to sort of share it with the world. So yeah, I'll keep you posted on it for sure.
Thank you. I'd really love to read it. And that would be it for this Futures Voices podcast. I just want to say thank you so much for your time that you take to join the Bosnia Herzegovina Futures Foundation. First, the webinars, now with the podcast, and we will see what futures hold for us. I just want to say again, thank you, and I hope that we will have many more opportunities to work together.
Thank you so much. No, I'm sure we will, and I'm hoping to meet with you and students in Bosnia very soon.